Bonjour et bienvenue à la discussion sur la rétrospective de Kazik Radwanski. J'aimerais remercier Andréa Picard, la modératrice de cette discussion, Kazik Radwanski, ainsi que Deragh Campbell pour être là avec nous aujourd'hui. La rétrospective sera disponible dès le 14 avril sur le site du cinéma public au www.cinemapublic.ca. Bonne discussion. Hi, and thank you for coming to the discussion on the retrospective of Kazik Radwanski. The Cinema Public would like to thank Andréa Picard for moderating the discussion, Kazik Radwanski and Deragh Campbell for participating, and a reminder that the discussion as well as the retrospective will be available on the Cinema Public website as of April 14th. On www.cinemapublic.ca. Have a nice discussion.
Merci, Beatrice. I also want to thank Roxane Saye and Charlotte Zed for asking me to moderate this discussion. And I'm so pleased to see Kaz and Deragh because it's been a really long time. In fact, the last time I saw you in person was on stage, I believe, at TIFF Bell Lightbox in September of 2019, which sounds strange to say. It was the second public screening of Anne at 13,000 feet. And I remember it as being a very special screening. And in fact, in the audience, there were quite a few members from the daycare, which was great. So although this retrospective is going to be online out of necessity, and we all look forward to being in a cinema again together, it's just a great pleasure to see you both again. And I want to begin very simply by talking about time. I feel like its rhythms have completely eluded me. And Kaz, I know that time is also a big part of your process, and Anne took a long time to make. I think that's part of, it could be budgetary reasons, you can talk about this, but also I feel like it's really built into the fabric of your films and sort of those documentary processes. So just in terms of the time it took to make Anne, and then Deragh, you can speak to this about your commitment to the role over time. And then now we have that added protracted release of the film. So you've both been living with Anne for a really long time. And I thought maybe we could start there.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, great question. Yeah, definitely time or touches on a lot of aspects of the film. But yeah, the main thing is that we shoot it over quite a long period of time. And also when I shoot quite a lot of takes and quite long takes. So it's interesting talking about documentary and realism that in some ways, you know, it's rehearsed or repeated so many times that it's not actually the moment, but it's somehow we gain something through shooting for such a long period of time. And then the film itself is fairly brief too. It's a short runtime. And it's this sort of, I think something I really love about cinema is recording something, processing something, thinking about something. You know, we're shooting, and then Isla, the editor, and I are talking about it between shoots. We're constantly shooting and thinking, and then to arrive at something very brief or fleeting, or you know, it's something that's evolved over, I think, working this way for a long time. Yeah, initially it was very practical. You know, it was a budgetary decision. You know, we had, you know, day jobs, and we had to work around schedules, and we had limited access to places, which, you know, encouraged a sporadic, drawn out style of shooting. But I think, you know, it's something that really grew into being a real key to the process. And maybe Deragh could speak on that, just us sort of feeling out the film, and, you know, Deragh volunteering at the daycare, and us just spending a lot of time learning about the character. And yeah, I'm curious Daragh's take on it.
Yeah, I mean, it taught me a lot about performing. If anything, like, as an actor, I think there's a bit of an illusion of control, or you want to have authorship over your character, and that can lead you to being a bit controlling over like what is shown of them, because then so much of the character is shaped in the edit. And it was really interesting to rather than every single moment supposed to be an articulation of my understanding of this character. It was a lot more about reacting to certain situations and this giving me information about the character and my understanding of her being built very gradually, maybe me never completely understanding her. And kind of feeling that in a weird way reflects a bit more how we move through the world. It's like, not though we are trying to express who we are to people, you can become really miserable when you're trying to control people's understanding of you at all times, and sort of allowing there to be this contradiction. And it was also, I think it's a healthy way to collaborate on a character as well, because then when I did see the film, I felt like I was kind of seeing Anne for the first time, through also how Isla and Kaz, what they showed of her.
I think you mentioned a word that's very important, collaboration. And I realized that I didn't actually give a proper introduction to this retrospective, not that I've programmed it, but I take for granted that people know who you are now, because I feel like both of you have breathed new life into Canadian cinema in such a really exciting way, both at home and abroad, and you're both exceedingly collaborative. So if you think of, you know, the films that have been produced by MDFF, and Deragh, you've also made a film, written a film, and then in this, and in Anne, I see that you have an additional writing credit. So all of your work is exceedingly collaborative, and it's created this real movement in Canada. And so I just wanted to talk about the nature of collaboration between producing, writing. Kaz, you're often working with the same crew, DP, editor. So can you talk a little bit about the nature of collaboration and how that's really, you know, it's propelled a movement in Canada that's being noticed on a really significant international level?
Yeah. Yeah, collaboration is a huge part of our process. And yeah, I mentioned Isla quite a lot. And so Isla and I have been working together over a decade. And we went to film school together, and she's cut everything that I've worked on. Similarly, Dan Montgomery has produced all my films, and Nikolai Mihailov came on board with around the time of Cutaway and Hammer. But yeah, I think the key to it is that it started with us all learning together and sort of emerging and finding our voices together, really thinking small, just in terms of like a half dozen of us working on this film, and it being just a meaningful collaboration, and all of us sort of having a big stake in the film, I think has always been at the heart of it. And I think, you know, a lot of it has to do with the trust that's necessary. When you watch Anne, the amount of intimacy and moments like that in the film, but also just the trust to sort of work on this for a year or two, that these are really sort of deep collaborations. So I think that, you know, has always been there. And then speaking of MDFF, or, you know, Canada as a whole, or other people we've collaborated with, yeah, when we see someone like-minded like Antoine Bourges or Nicholas Preda, that yeah, we go out of our way to connect and to find like-minded people that yeah, a lot has happened in the past 10 years. Yeah, working with Antoine, working with Nicholas Preda, Andréa Bussmann, Sophia now, all of these collaborations have been just so vital, just to, I think, really just to sort of empower each other and just help people sort of stay true. And again, when I think of Isla and Dan and Nikolai, and of course Deragh too, it's, yeah, a real vital part of this has been those collaborations and trust between each other.
Yeah, I think it requires a kind of egolessness too, that we're all kind of serving the movie, I suppose, and that means sometimes having this kind of flexibility where sometimes you are completely reacting to someone else's idea, following through on that idea, and then people are also bending and like maybe letting me try out something that I'd be interested in trying out. And you have this kind of, like the way that Kaz and I have talked about how those scenes in the film worked. It's like having the scene built from multiple angles, where Kaz can see things that I can't see, I can see things that he can't see. And if you do have a trusting communication, you have more information to know when to move on, when to push things in certain directions. And there is this kind of, it's not about one person's control being the most important, and that doesn't really have to be negotiated. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, Deragh. Yeah, and thinking back to how we worked on the film, that we talked about it so much before we made the film. We always talked about how we shot the film for 2 years, but I feel like we talked about it and researched it for a while too. But so much of it when we were shooting, and just like sort of what you were describing, that would happen to me often, that I would think I would have an amazing scene, and it would fall flat, and I would sort of pick up on that and sort of react to how you were reacting in the scene. Or similarly, a minor scene would sort of erupt and be way more interesting. There's I guess what I'm trying to say, that there is a very sort of verbal collaboration where we talk things to death, and then at other times, a lot of it I think was just sort of reacting to what the other person saw in the material and following their instincts a little bit. And again, I would say that's totally true about Isla when she looks at the footage, and then also Nikolai on what his eye is drawn to. And also, yeah, I think his collaboration with you was pretty important as well, right? The trust between the two of you, and how close Nikolai always is with the camera. That that there's, I guess, a very literal discussion, but then a lot of it is, as we work for so long, that the point I like the collaboration to get to is when so much of it is just sort of instinctual or felt rather than articulated, that we can get to sort of these sort of intangible sort of sparks that sort of come out of the collaboration.
So how would you quantify the sort of balance between extemporization and what is written?
One example I was talking about the other day is the scene with Deragh where she's talking about the scene with Anne where she's talking about the thermometer that broke, and that was a story that was written. It's one of those stories that's sort of stranger than real life. A story that my grade 3 teacher told me and always sort of stuck with me. So that story was the script, and then how sort of Deragh worked with that as a starting point is sort of, there's variation with that of just getting that to land. And then the children in the scene were completely unscripted. And then it becomes, so starting with that sort of very overt sort of conflict or unusual sort of story, and then it sort of becomes a balancing act with the kids and reacting to them. And we shot that scene over multiple weekends working with child actors, because we could only really work with them for about an hour or two at a time. So it sort of fluctuates between being, very staged and set up, and then almost sort of pragmatic in some ways, and following, the reactions of children, but then also Deragh making her own adjustments. To give you a sense. And then other scenes are, way looser, more documentary-like. A lot of the scenes with Matt Johnson, grew as we shot with him. So there isn't one approach, but there definitely are some things that are very sort of firmly scripted or starting points, I suppose.
I was actually going to ask about the children because I rewatched all of your films recently, and I went back to Green Crayons, and it's such a beautiful film, and there's some tremendous wisdom that come from those kids. And not all filmmakers want to work with children or animals. They talk about the sort of spontaneity and how difficult it is to control. And you have consistently worked with children. There's an infant, in Tower, obviously the sons and how heavy this hammer, and then the kids in the daycare here and some of the shorts. So I'm just curious about this desire to work with kids.
I think it comes through a couple places. I think the other big motif of my work is construction and renovation, and then children. And I think maybe the simplest way is my parents. So my mom has run a daycare for the past 40 years. My dad and my uncle work in renovation. So I think those have always been inspirations. And it's also maybe just taking from my own life, you know, things that are around me. I've always sort of written for what's around me. But a real breakthrough for me as a filmmaker was a documentary I made. A documentary before Princess Margaret or Assault, about a boy with behavioral problems. And I made that at my mom's daycare. He was sort of this boy had sort of reached the point where they didn't know how to diagnose him, and his parents were concerned, and somehow it ended up that I would follow him around and film him, and I would just study his face, and it was fascinating. Like, there were it was the first time I felt like I captured something other people might want to watch. And you know, around the same time, I think I discovered Alan King and Warrendale, and started thinking about, you know, documentary and fiction and sort of actuality dramas. So I think that planted a lot of seeds. But in general, I like working with children. I think they're just sort of natural performers, just inherently creative. I just love that. I feel like it's, you know, obviously there is a lot of ego there, but it feels egoless. They just feel so innocent, and it's so easy to just, for me to work with them, that, you know, even if it doesn't go wrong, it somehow becomes a blessing in disguise. So I do like tapping into that chaos. Yeah, so Oliver in Anna 13,000 Feet brought so much to the film. He's the boy who talks about sharks. Like, all of that was Oliver's dialogue. So it was really nice collaborating with him, but also just his personality too. I mean, sure, the sharks, but just his outbursts and his, you know, he brought that every time we worked with him, that sort of intensity, I guess.
Amazing energy, for sure.
Yeah.
That sort of leads into my next question, which you've also mentioned. It's the physicality of the shooting and also the physicality of the performance. I mean, Deragh, this is a very lived-in performance with subtle modulations. So I just want to talk about, you know, the handheld camera, how it is that there's a very shallow depth of field. So I feel like there's this indeterminacy, very few establishing shots. You start your films mid-action, they sort of end without resolution. And this might sound strange, you know, critics and programmers have often mentioned the Dardenne brothers or Cassavetes. And I've been looking at a lot of paintings, and I think there's something about the way that you depict flesh that is very unique. And looking at Lucien Freud's paintings, and just skin is such a big recurrence in your films. I don't know if you can comment on that.
Skin is interesting. I haven't really ever talked about that so specifically, skin. I mean, but I guess, you know, thinking back to Princess Margaret Boulevard, I remember that really being something we thought about a lot. But yeah, or How Heavy This Hammer, I remember really wanting, maybe not skin, but his presence to sort of overwhelm. Or one of the earlier shorts, Out in That Deep Blue Sea, I wanted it to feel like he was sweating on the audience, that there is, but I find that harder to articulate exactly what we're going for. And I think Nikolai brings a lot as well to it. But yeah, there's some sort of visceral sort of thing that I like overwhelming at times, of sort of, and that is something I think has evolved a bit. It's interesting talking about Cassavetes and the Dardenne brothers, because I think obviously they're both influences, but I think in different ways. With Cassavetes in particular, I really like the feeling of disorientation and entering a scene and not exactly knowing who each person is or what the dynamic is. And that's something we've definitely thought about a lot with Anne, how we wanted to start the film, how we wanted to orient people. But yeah, I think a lot of it too is this feeling of being very close and very intimate to someone we don't totally understand. I remember a quote that really stuck with me was by Lucretia Martel about Headless Woman. And it was something about this being very close to something mysterious or something which is always, I think, is kind of the goal, being very close, but also alienated and confused. And I think that sort of lends itself to like questions about empathy and how we empathize with people and how we read people in situations. But it's something about sort of tapping into this vitality and then sort of just keeping it slightly out of our reach with moments of insight and sort of just oscillating around that. I think that's what I'm after, or what I find the most stimulating when I work on a film. But yeah, the skin was a really good observation. I'm still thinking about that, and makes me almost want to go back and look at, or even just like Derek in Tower, and his hair, and you know, he has a scar on his face throughout it too. So yeah, skin is definitely a metaphor sometimes. Yeah.
Well, bodies and also bodily fluids. I mean, there's urination, there's vomiting, there's the blood. So there's definitely that physicality. And I like how you mentioned this mystery, because there's a distance, but there's so many close-ups and that sense of disorientation. But yet your films capture the sort of unpredictable nature of human behavior. And it sounds sort of cliche, but how life can change on a dime based on someone else's reaction, based on anything that can happen in the most ordinary lives. And I think that all of your films capture a certain sense of extreme behavior, while not being extreme. I mean, we're not talking about murderers or heroin addicts, but it's still extreme within something that's quote unquote normality. So I'm wondering if maybe Deragh can talk a little bit about the physicality of her performance and being so close to the camera, while also emulating the sense of you're not know what's going to happen next, because a lot of it also feels like it's in your head. So just capturing those subtle modulations, which I think gives, you know, the performance its brilliant nature.
Yeah, my mother paid me a compliment once. That was just that I'm not a vain actor, which I thought was nice. And I was talking about this recently, how I've always had a lot of confusion about how I appear to other people, how I'm perceived. And so I kind of, as a strategy, as a human, have to kind of just think as little about how I'm perceived by other people as possible. And that's become really essential to acting for me. I mean, just as in life, we have to, you know, suspend our awareness of mortality in order to even be able to function. There is a just like suspending the presence of the camera, suspending an awareness of this being a film that's part of a story that will have a life in the world, that will, you know, be part of a career. Like, there is just an amount of like necessary forgetting that happens, and like a necessary, I mean, even going back to thinking about children, like that is all about like focus on the child, and also like focus on the safety of the child and like the happiness of the child. And in that too, like working with non-professional actors has shaped the actor that I am so much, because I feel a lot like I'm taking care of them, you know, or that so much of me is about being aware of them. And like working, for instance, with Nathan in Fail to Appear, it was my job to keep him, to sustain the illusion for him, right? Like I'm having to keep his entire focus. And yeah, there is something about that hopefully, yeah, allows for the feeling of my body not knowing that it's being observed, letting you be quite close to my body, I think. If that answers the question.
Just going back to looking at the three features, they're all very driven by one protagonist. So in that way, casting is key. Obviously, the two first films are focused on men, and this is the first time you turn toward making a portrait of a woman. So I'd like to talk about that shift, but also casting. Are you writing with someone in mind, Kaz?
Yeah, I definitely wrote this with Deragh in mind in a 13,000 feet. With the previous two features, I wrote them knowing I'd have to rethink it once I cast it. But those projects were written very sort of loosely and sort of thematically, almost with that idea of a protagonist, and almost, I think what I gravitated to a lot when I was first making films is I was just uncertain of a lot of my ideas, that I almost felt like a young sort of angsty, very introspective filmmaker, and I really liked the process of filtering it through protagonists like Deragh or Erwin, almost re-challenging my ideas and sort of retailoring them to a real sort of persona. That both those performances are more, I would say, try to choose my words carefully here, but sort of non-actor like performances where what they gave to the screen is sort of what we got. That there was less sort of range, I suppose. That they're great actors, both Erwin and Deragh, and they were so committed and gave so much to it. But it was sort of, there was a very specific range, and I would sort of reshape the film around that, sort of refilter my ideas through them, and sort of learn how they spoke and learn how they behaved and what moments they would be interested in. And so when it came to working with Deragh on Anne, I was sort of overwhelmed by the potential, and I'm used to that sort of creative constraint of working with these other actors, that I felt sort of rudderless at times, or just not sure how to shape the film, because Deragh can do so much, and was up for so much too. Even just her talking about working with the children or on Fail to Appear, I think that's another sort of hidden secret of Anne, is that both Deragh and Matt are both directors in their own right, and are also fascinated with, I think, similar things I am, and are chasing those sort of moments and interactions and sort of truths in film too. So yeah, I think I definitely had to readjust a lot throughout the process, and sort of find ways to sort of narrow it down. And I think a lot of it too was just learning from Deragh too, and trusting her instincts with the material. But certainly at a point, yeah, I was definitely overwhelmed by the process. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah, and it also made us want to lean into working at the daycare and working with children, because I think that was my comfort zone of, again, having something to play off of, having something to sort of filter it through.
I just want to get back to this notion of, quotidian lives for a second. In each of the films, I feel like there's some extreme behavior, there's some destructive behavior, but I also feel like there's a sense of retreat and self-protection, and there's a lack of judgment. And sometimes there are moments of absurdity, but also tremendous sadness. But then when I think of Tower, where he takes this ice bath, where he's really doing it, or Deragh jumping out of a plane, what is it about these moments, Kaz?
Yeah, you're right. It's interesting that they have these in Hammer too. It's really just that he's playing rugby as well. That there are these sort of, I think, very simply, it's just sort of the counterpoint, I think, to their experience. Especially with Tower and Hammer, like, him being in Hammer depressive, but then playing full contact rugby once a week, just to sort of it captures something about how people view these problems. But I think you tapped onto something too about it being retreat. I think that is the theme that really, came out of Tower and Hammer was, and I think it's something true about depression, or even some people are okay with being depressed. They're just not okay with other people knowing that they're depressed, and this weird sort of putting up or not being able to talk about things. People, wanting to give advice, wanting to help, and that somehow being alienating to the protagonist. That's something that's always fascinated me. Or a goal of my films is I want every character to be understandable, but to find, alienation from sort of banal moments, but also from alienation from well-minded or nice people, that people are inherently trying to help, but for some reason it's oppressive to the protagonist. And it's out of their sort of capacity at the moment, and Hammer, him just, and, comparing Tower and Hammer, Tower, Deragh was interesting, but he was always kind of powerless still. But in Hammer, I just love the idea of someone who was sort of weak and wanted to retreat, but was powerful enough to just sort of end conversations and to sort of just walk away, which I quite like. So I guess that rationale might be in Anne as well, as the skydiving or some of Anne's decisions in the film to sort of different ways that she can control the narrative and not do things or avoid things, or moments that I think I find kind of exciting.
It's funny, this this physicality, like if there's one thing that guides the projects that I choose to participate in, it's like whether it is a director or a script or a character, or like the one guiding principle ends up being like a desire to be impacted by the shooting. Like oh, I want to have the experience of being a postal worker or something, or like I want there to be some kind of trace of it, like how I have this strange fascination with keeping objects that a character had. Like I remember coming downstairs one morning when we were still shooting and like finding the character's cat collar on my table and just being like, it is so strange that their life is in my life. And that I think it's funny that so often you're asked to bring your own experiences to a character, and I've actually always really hated that. But the idea that an experience as a character and an experience of a film impacts my life, and that the history of a character and the history of a story like is contained within my own life and remembered by my body, is to me the most exciting thing.
In talking about Anne, I think it's so important that there's no prognosis given, you know, and it puts us, the viewers, in a position of questioning at every moment. And Kaz, you have this amazing ability to create this underlying tension in all of your films, you know, where it's that spontaneity where you're not sure what's going to come next. But with Anne, you're with her in moments of happiness, of excitement, and you can see where even Matt says, you know, like, you're keeping me on my toes, and that's also very exciting. So can you talk about that idea of staying away from any kind of prognosis?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and again, Deragh and I had many conversations about this, especially when we were researching it. I mean, whether or not, you know, researching different, you know, prognoses and or reading, you know, memoirs of people's lives, talking with doctors. We even did a few therapy sessions with a therapist.
I want to see that.
Not make it in the film. Yeah, those were not successful exercises, maybe. But yeah, I mean, part of the process too is that we had a number of doctors and medical professionals as consultants on the film. And with this film in particular, I really, as we were editing it, I really just wanted to screen it for as many people to sort of see how people reacted to it. So yeah, a lot of the usual suspects, but yeah, we screened it for a lot of doctors and people with medical backgrounds, and the feedback was always the same, that the film is more useful without it being prescriptive, without saying exactly what it is that the character has. That it's more useful, even if they were to use it as like a teaching device, because it's true to life. And beyond that, that's sort of how I feel about it. You know, people in my life, like loved ones who I know have a history of mental health, you know, that they take medications. I don't know exactly what medications they take. You know, I feel like there is a line where you can understand without knowing all of the details. And again, yeah, just thinking to how we wanted to enter the film too, that I think sometimes people look for that in a film. They want to understand what the dynamic is and what the point of the film is early, especially if it being, you know, in a sort of realist setting. And that's something I definitely wanted to avoid. I didn't want to set up this dynamic of, you know, what was wrong with the world and what was alienating her, or what she was doing wrong. And this is why. That the longer we could kind of prolong it and kind of keep it in this sort of uncertain realm, just felt had the most depth, and that it kept it, you know, fascinating and engaging for me. Yeah.
I know we've mentioned Cassavetes and the Dardennes and Alan King. And you're both like incredible cinephiles, and your breadth and knowledge of film history is amazing. And you know, I see you often at the Cinematheque, so yeah. But I'm wondering if there are any films that you watched specifically before the making of Anne.
Yeah, tons. I'm trying to think what are like the most yeah, I always like to sort of talk about, we can even talk about more contemporary examples. Yeah, I think Marin Ada has been an influence, Forest for the Trees. Even when you said green crayons, I remember that's the first time I met Marin Ada. She saw green crayons at the Berlinale, and I remember like how much and that was all the way back in like 2010, and that's back when I saw Forest for the Trees. And so I think things like that were definitely percolating. Again, when we talk about other films, I can think of other sort of more recent American directors that I think have been influential. Azazel Jacobs' Mama's Man was a big one. Frownland by Ronald Bronstein. Keen by Lodge Kerrigan were all sort of big, just thinking of how I view realism and how I work with cameras in a sort of contemporary setting. But I'm trying to think, Deragh, I'm trying to think if there was a really good one that we really plunged into. We're sort of doing this process right now with our next film and trying to find, we watch a lot of films. It's funny, we forget some of the influences, but I'm trying to think specifically. Like we've said Cassavetes, like Cassavetes is a huge one, of course, and almost thinking of specific Cassavetes scenes. Obviously Woman Under the Influence and the sort of swan dance in the backyard scene, I think was on my mind with some of the daycare scenes. I think the coverage of in Husbands, there's a scene where they're in a bar and they're all sort of singing, and I think that camera work, Nikolai and I watched it when we were approaching the staff meeting scene. I think the idea of using my mom in the film, it probably has its roots in Cassavetes too, that I've always wanted to work with my mom and I could never find the right way to do it. And it happened. We had to literally be shooting the film at her daycare. So of course Cassavetes, but then a more recent director like Nathan Silver. I love the way he works with his mom. And I think that had an inspiration on the film as well. That's sort of broad smattering. I'm sure there's a few other gems. Skydiving. How can you think of a skydiving film without Leos Carax? And so I think that was an inspiration for sure, in a very different way. But yeah, certainly.
It's funny because when I started acting on film, I kind of thought of like the idea of naturalism as being something really small. Just being very controlled, and all my early characters are really shy. And I think what was interesting for me was this idea of like actually what we show, especially when we're in conversation, is not very small at all. And especially too, like I come from a family of 4 generations of theater actors, and it's funny, my cousin just watched the movie the other day, and he's like, what you're doing is so completely different from what our family members are doing. And I'm actually really interested in kind of looking at that and seeing if I'm going to find my own path into something that is a bit more theatrical, because I think theatricality is in how we converse with people. And I always thought it was a funny discrepancy that like for a while I was me as a person is more animated than my characters, whereas now I think Anne surpasses me in terms of outgoingness. But I'm interested now in like looking a bit more at kind of like actresses from like early Hollywood and stuff, like looking at like John Stahl films, or like looking at like Lillian Gish, looking at some strange less naturalistic performances perhaps.
Do you want to say anything about your new project?
I think the main thing is that I just want to work with Deragh and Matt again. That I think we reached a really interesting point working together, that it just seemed like so much potential. And so I'm writing the next film with both of them in mind, and just different ways for them to collide. that it's not a sequel by any means, but yeah, it was so nice to have that. For me, it was a real breakthrough working with Deragh and also Matt, of just finding collaborators. We've said collaboration so many times today, but just actors that can be collaborators on that level. So yeah, I guess the story's kind of still evolving, and but it's going to be very much a Toronto story downtown. We've shot a few tests for it, just even during COVID, on the streets, that we really want the streets of Toronto to be a part of it, and just find ways to really just get lost in whatever happens between Deragh and Matt when they're on screen together.
I think in a funny way, actually, one of the key influences to the Anne performance is actually Matt. Like, there were certain points where I was like, am I imitating Matt at Matt? like just his, because I love his performance in Nirvana, the band, the show, because he does really react to everything. Like, everything a person says to him, he kind of has this like, whoa, 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 like enormous reaction to, but somehow you completely believe that reaction belongs to a real human being. And I thought it was so generous of him in our scenes that he kind of, that he allowed me this enormous amount of space to be the one making him uncomfortable. Yeah.
And you really feel it. It's funny because in the morning where he drives Anne to the daycare and he's wearing those sunglasses, I thought those could be Anne's sunglasses too. I think we have to wrap up soon, but this is kind of a perfect segue because I wanted to ask about Toronto, in fact, because all of your films are so site specific, and you could easily shoot in Toronto with Toronto not playing Toronto, which happens quite frequently, but we see the CN Tower in Tower, Bloor and Lansdowne, the subways, and your next film, obviously, on the streets of Toronto. So can you just talk a little bit about Toronto and how it's been an influence on you?
I think so. Yeah, like it's always been a challenge and an inspiration, I think. Again, I can't help but think of that parallel when you said sort of quotidian or banality. I think that is something Toronto has to offer to the world, that it is, for a city its size, it's fairly safe and fairly banal, but at the same time, people living within that city have obviously stories to tell and drama in their life. So I think I've often thought about like what story is really suited or appropriate for Toronto. And then at the same time, what can Toronto offer the world, and have arrived at these films. But yes, interesting thinking of the CN Tower or some of these landmarks. I mean, there's a side to it too, that I've spent my life here. I've grown up here. So the daycare, or shooting at the daycare, or shooting at Bloor and Lansdowne, where I lived for years, that I always gravitate to that because I think there's more that I'll just be able to pull on the day, that I just sort of know, I have a memory or a sensation of it and will want to sort of work with that. But yeah, it's definitely a point of pride, I think, in a weird way, of just wanting to make films here, wanting to find stories here, wanting to figure out how to work with Toronto, that it's not always obvious, but I think if it could be done successfully, then it's a really sort of, a lot of fulfillment can come from it. But yeah, I definitely plan on shooting all my films in Toronto for the foreseeable future too, I think. Yeah.
Such a strange thing too, because Canadian identity is also so unexplored, but in this really strange way where, yeah, it's kind of unprobed, and we have these sort of like ideas of what it is to be Canadian that are so protective and like strangely distancing, like these ideas of friendliness and things like that. Like I just want that to be probed slightly, and to like actually discover like what some of the strangeness of being Canadian is.
Yeah, it's funny how that can kind of pop out of the film too, or just when some people have watched and describing it as very Canadian or having very Canadian moments.
I don't even know what that
kind of emerge. It's like, for instance, you breaking into your mom's house and her, everything being unlocked, for instance, or is like a Canadian sort of ism, right? Like unlocked doors, but yeah, I think there's sort of like a polite alienation too that kind of comes out of these films too. This sort of politeness, but that's kind of distancing. It seems like a Canadian temperament, or especially in a big city. Yeah, and then sometimes it's something very overt, like a raccoon being on screen. But yeah, I think also, I mean, a step further, and I didn't really even think of it until I made Hammer. But I think part of it is maybe a lack of history. I think with Hammer too, initially, when I was casting that, I was initially thrown by Erwin and him being Belgian and having a very thick Flemish accent. I'm like, because I definitely wanted an actor that was big and large and looked like he could play rugby, but Belgium isn't really known for its history of rugby. And, I felt more inclined to go with a Canadian actor. But his accent was sort of perfect, or like the perfect kind of mystery or thing that subtly sort of, you just knew his past was a little different or from somewhere else. It's something that just clicked. I mean, both my parents are not from Canada, and there's something there too. I can't totally put my finger on it, but I feel it sometimes when I travel and I go to other cities. I go to San Sebastian or Vienna, and I'm almost overwhelmed by the amount of culture and just people have lived in a place for so long and have all these identities. And there is a certain anonymous feeling or placelessness sometimes of Toronto, especially if you get overwhelmed by concrete, that I think thematically there's something that sort of comes from, these three protagonists in the features that are somehow out of step with society, somehow can't quite connect. I think I don't know if that's a Toronto thing, but it could be.
Maybe that thing I was talking about like having a confusion about how I'm perceived is like not a me problem, but actually like a Canadian problem. Like how you just like really, don't understand how we kind of think that we're perceived as Americans or as British people, but as soon as you're in the States, people are like, no, you're different than this. Like we're constantly trying to understand. Who we are.
I think that's a good thing. I still don't hear the Canadian accent. I do not hear. But.
Yeah.
But I do think there's there's the specificity in the landmarks, but also the way that you shoot, which is so visceral without the establishing shots, that it's also an indeterminate space. So in that way, you're creating these characters that can be fundamentally Canadian, or also, we're also a land of immigrants, for instance. So there's a real mix. But then they're like really fundamentally human. And I remember when I did a Q&A with Angela Shalanek, I was just struck by something where someone was just talking about like the inherent melancholy of her characters, and yet they just go on no matter what. And she just said this thing that sort of floored me. And she said, no matter what happens, you have to keep living. You just go, you have no choice, And I feel that with your characters too, whether they're in retreat or there's escapism, but they're going on, and your films end kind of abruptly. There's no resolution, so we're not quite sure what happens yet, but then we still have that faith that they're gonna go on.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully put. Yeah, I really like that quote, and I love Angela Shalanek. I mean, she's one of my favorite filmmakers. But yeah, that quote. I mean, I think a lot of the reason that I made films or decided to make films was just I was so depressed in high school, but it was always this feeling of wanting to engage in it somehow and wanting to go on, and I think that is an undercurrent with these characters, that they are depressed and kind of lost, but they're still spontaneous. The films are still spontaneous in some ways. There's still laughter, there's still sort of humor, despite some of their existences being pretty lost and miserable in some ways. But that seems like a good note to end on. But yeah, I really like that quote.
Well, thank you both for this great discussion, for the amazing film. I hope the retrospective goes well.